They say that silence is holy, that within stone walls, behind heavy oak doors, there is peace. But silence can be many things. It can be calm, serene, sacred, or it can be a warning. In the convents of Europe centuries ago, silence was rarely peace. Some say the convents were places of devotion, places where faith rose higher than the tallest spire, where prayers filled the air like smoke, drifting endlessly toward heaven. But the truth is far darker. A young woman named Ilara arrived at one such convent. She was full of hope, of belief, of innocence. She believed she could dedicate her life to God, to service, to obedience. She believed in the power of prayer, the sanctity of the habit, the holiness of the cloistered walls. And for a while, the convent seemed as she expected. Tall stone walls, high arched windows, gardens full of roses and herbs, the smell of incense drifting through long corridors. But beauty in the convent, as in life, is often only skin deep. Beneath the ritual, beneath the prayers, beneath the silent obedience, there are shadows. Shadows that move when you think no one is watching. Shadows that grow into monsters. Ilara did not arrive to be broken. She arrived to serve. She arrived with faith, but the convent had other plans. Slowly, quietly, invisibly, the convent began to shape her, not into a saint, not into a woman of God, into something else. By the time anyone realized what she had become, it was too late. Pause. Whispered Latin prayers drift briefly, almost indistinct, like voices through a veil. This is the story of the nun who became a monster, not through violence, not through madness, but through the very walls that were meant to protect her. Through faith, through obedience, through silence. If you listen closely even now, you can hear the faint echo of her footsteps, the soft turning of pages in empty chapels, the shadow that watches from the corner of the room. She waits, and her story begins here.
The convent sat on a hill, overlooking the village below. From the outside, it looked serene, picturesque even. Stone walls that had stood for centuries, windows tall and arched, letting in pale streams of sunlight, gardens neatly kept, flowers arranged in patterns so perfect they seemed unnatural. But inside, the air was heavier, not with smoke, not with incense, not even with prayer, but with expectation. A pressure that weighed on every step, every breath, every whispered thought. Sister Ilara arrived in the early morning. The gates opened, and she stepped into a world that promised holiness, but demanded obedience above all else. Every sound she made echoed. Every glance she gave was noted. Every movement measured. And every mistake punished. The rules were many, and they were more than rules. They were instruments. Rise before dawn. Kneel for hours until the skin of your knees burned and the bones ached. Speak only when spoken to. Silence was obedience. Obedience was survival. Meals were modest, measured, quiet. The corridors were walked in pairs, eyes forward, lips sealed. Mistakes were noted in margins, whispered to the abbess, and remembered for months. The villagers admired the convent from afar. They saw only piety. They smelled only incense. They heard only prayer. No one asked about what happened behind those walls. And for Ilara, at first, it was all devotion, faith, hope, innocence. She believed she was entering a sanctuary, a place of service, of learning, of guidance. She did not know that the convent had already chosen its own way to shape her. The abbess, the matron of this house, watched her closely, not with kindness, not with love, but with calculation. Every action, every reaction, every hesitation, observed. The other nuns, too, watched, some out of loyalty, some out of fear. And slowly, Ilara realized compliance was not optional. The walls themselves seemed alive, watching, waiting, judging. At night, in the dormitory, the silence was deafening. The beds lined in rows, the candles guttering. No whispers, no laughter, no comfort. Only shadows stretching along the stone floors. And sometimes the faintest sound of someone crying. Quietly, so quietly it could have been imagined. By the end of her first month, Ilara understood this was no ordinary convent. This was a place where obedience was tested, endurance measured, and the soul slowly carved. And somewhere deep inside, a seed began to grow, not of faith, not of devotion, something darker. It began almost imperceptibly. A flicker in her eyes, a hesitation in her steps, a question in her voice that should have been swallowed by obedience. At first, the abbess said nothing. "She is young, she will learn," she murmured to herself, unaware of the subtle storm growing in the girl before her. But the convent had its ways, ways that were invisible to outsiders, ways that shaped even the willing. Tasks were designed to wear the spirit down. Penances were administered not just for sin, but for thought. A glance in the wrong direction, a pause too long in prayer, a whispered laugh in the corridors. And slowly, something inside Ilara began to shift. Anger. Obedience had once felt natural. Faith had once been her armor. But now the constant pressure, the unrelenting scrutiny, the whispered punishments began to twist her. Fear became fascination. Pain became a game to be studied. Humiliation became a pattern to observe. And she learned quickly. She learned which actions would provoke the abbess, which whispers would earn a glance of suspicion, which mistakes could be made without punishment. And with that knowledge, she began to hide, to kneel while plotting, to smile while watching, to obey while thinking something entirely different. The other nuns noticed nothing. She was always polite, always attentive, always quiet. And yet, she was no longer the girl who had entered. She was something different, something carefully contained, something patient. The first sign of her emerging darkness was small, a slight manipulation of the novice who shared her dormitory, a whispered suggestion here, a subtle misdirection there. No one suspected, and she began to enjoy it.
the quiet power of observation, the subtle shift in control, the way fear and obedience could be molded without a word. By the end of her first year, she had become invisible, not unnoticed, but unmeasured, unjudged, the perfect observer. And as she knelt for her nightly prayers, alone in the dormitory, she understood something that would define the next decade of her life. Power does not require cruelty to exist, but cruelty, once understood, can become irresistible. This was the beginning, the first shift, the spark that in time would consume her entirely, and the convent would unknowingly nurture it. By the second year, the convent's true nature began to reveal itself. At first, the punishments were minor, a whispered correction in the dining hall, a few minutes longer kneeling on the cold stone floor, the abrupt removal of privileges, like a candle snuffed quietly in the night. But soon the cruelty deepened. Novices began disappearing from duties for days at a time, their beds left untouched, candles left burning in empty rooms, whispers of faint screams carried along stone corridors at night. Some of the sisters fainted during prayer, some wept quietly into their hands, some never returned. Ilara watched, studied, learned. She learned which punishments instilled terror, which words could be twisted into fear, which silences carried the heaviest weight. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, she began to experiment, not openly, not violently, but subtly, carefully. A young novice spoke out of turn. Ilara whispered a small suggestion, an innocent misdirection. The result? Fear, embarrassment, compliance. Ilara smiled quietly, unseen. The first real control had arrived. She observed the abbess with the same care, each glance, each command, each reprimand recorded in memory, in thought, in strategy. The abbess, a woman of rigid rules, of iron discipline, never noticed. She praised Ilara publicly for diligence. She rewarded her subtly for obedience. But with each passing month, the power that once terrified Ilara now thrilled her. Cruelty became a game, and she learned its rules quickly. A misplaced candle to cause confusion, a whispered rumor to sow doubt, a small misstep orchestrated to provoke punishment in others. The other nuns were unaware. They did not see the manipulations, they only felt the results. Fear and obedience spread through the convent like a virus, carried quietly on Ilara's actions. The abbess never suspected. She could not see that her own creation had learned too well, that her tools of control had been studied, replicated, and improved. Ilara had become invisible, perfectly obedient to the eye, perfectly cunning in silence. And so the convent continued, unknowing, nurturing the darkness that had been quietly growing within one of its youngest sisters. In the corridors of faith, in the shadows of prayer, the monster had been born.
Transformation is rarely sudden, rarely obvious. It begins as a whisper, a shift in thought, a moment where the world suddenly seems pliable. Ilara had watched, studied, and learned for years. She had observed fear, observed obedience, observed pain.
and she understood it now. She could bend it, shape it, control it. The abbess had unknowingly created the perfect student, but she had also created something else, something that had no place in Holy Scripture, something beyond obedience, beyond faith, something that craved control. At first it was subtle, a whispered suggestion to a novice, a slight misdirection during chores, a careful placement of candles to create unease. But subtlety gave way to confidence. Observation became manipulation. Fear became a tool. Silence became her ally. The other nuns were unaware. They trusted her. They confided in her. They admired her devotion. And all the while, she was learning, cataloging reactions, noting weaknesses, perfecting the ways she could influence without detection. The abbess praised her publicly, rewarded her subtly, and with every praise, every nod of approval, Ilara grew bolder, not in outward rebellion, but in the quiet, deliberate shaping of the convent's rhythm. Tasks, punishments, rituals, all could be used to her advantage. Every whispered complaint could be amplified. Every fear could be nurtured. The convent, unknowingly, had taught her. It had molded her into a creature of control, a master of the unseen, and she relished it. She was no longer the obedient girl who knelt in the dormitory, praying for guidance. She had become something else, patient, calculating, observant, a shadow among shadows. And as the nights passed, she understood the most powerful truth of all. Power does not need to be declared. Power does not need to be wielded openly. Power is invisible. Power is subtle. Power is watching and waiting. In the quiet of her room, alone in the convent's dormitory, she smiled faintly, a smile that was not of joy, not of faith, but of understanding. And the understanding was clear. She had changed. She was no longer merely a nun. She had become something more. By now, Ilara had learned the full extent of her abilities. She could observe, wait, and guide events without anyone noticing. Fear, obedience, guilt, all were tools at her disposal, and she began to use them. At first it was small, a candle left out of place to unsettle a novice, a whispered comment that sowed doubt in the mind of a sister, an accidental spill in the dining hall that seemed innocent but caused weeks of subtle tension. No one suspected her. She smiled politely during prayers, knelt perfectly in line, folded her hands at the proper moments, and all the while she studied every reaction, every fear, every hesitation. Then she began to escalate. Doors were locked during vigils. Tasks were assigned in ways that caused quiet panic. Punishments were orchestrated to appear natural, inevitable. A minor mistake here, a slight misstep there, all leading to maximum discomfort, minimal trace. The other nuns whispered in secret. Some feared her. Some admired her. Some suspected something but lacked proof. And the abbess? She never noticed. She had become a master of the invisible. Every subtle movement she made shifted the balance of power in the convent. Every small act of cruelty, carefully measured, spread fear without trace. Every smile, every folded hand, every obedient posture, a mask that hid the predator beneath. She orchestrated accidents, minor injuries, small humiliations, each seeming the fault of the victim, the walls, or fate itself. The novices learned quickly. Ilar's favor could mean safety, her disapproval, consequences that no one could explain. The convent became a place where shadows were alive. Screams were muffled by walls. Rituals became traps. Faith was twisted into obedience through fear. And Ilara? She watched. She studied. She catalogued reactions. And she relished the control. Some nuns were broken completely. Some fled in secret, leaving their vows behind. Some remained, terrified, obedient, forever altered. And still, the villagers outside admired the convent. They smelled only incense. They heard only prayer. They saw only devotion. The monster had emerged, and she wore the habit of a nun. Faith, devotion, and piety had been her armor, but they had also been her weapon. And in the quiet corridors of the convent, she was now the only one who controlled the fear.
By this time, the convent had changed. Not outwardly. To the villagers, it still appeared holy, still pristine, still devoted. But inside, the air had grown heavy. Every shadow seemed longer. Every whisper carried weight. Every glance, every hesitation, every prayer was observed and measured. Ilara's influence had become absolute, not through force, not through punishment, but through fear, subtlety, and precision. She orchestrated punishments that appeared natural. Mistakes were magnified into disasters. Minor slips were transformed into lessons for all to see. Some nuns were driven to tears during vigils. Some began to falter in prayer, the fear too heavy to bear. Some simply disappeared for weeks at a time. And through it all, Ilara watched, learned, calculated. Fear, suffering, obedience, she had turned them into instruments, instruments of control, instruments of power. She had become invisible and untouchable, perfectly obedient in public, perfectly cunning in secret. Every punishment she directed, every fear she nurtured, every whispered suggestion, it was all done with the precision of a master. The abbess who had once shaped her now relied on her, praised her publicly, rewarded her subtly. Unknowingly, she had elevated the very monster she had tried to mold. The convent became a place where no one was truly safe. The young novices learned quickly. One misstep, one disobedience, one glance out of place, and Ilara's influence would find them. Some never recovered. Some were broken silently. Some were forced to bend so completely that their faith itself was a prison. And still, to the outside world, the convent remained holy, serene, devout,
safe. The villagers saw only order, only devotion, only peace. They could not see the shadows behind the walls, could not hear the quiet cries, could not feel the weight of fear that lingered in every stone, in every hallway, in every silent dormitory. And in the middle of it all, Ilara smiled, not openly, not triumphantly, but quietly, patiently, because she understood the ultimate truth. Fear is stronger than obedience. Fear is quieter than anger. Fear lasts longer than punishment. And in the quiet corridors, under the shadow of devotion and faith, she had become a monster the convent could not see nor stop, a shadow that would linger long after she was gone. Ilara did not fall. There was no trial, no confession, no dramatic revelation. Monsters like her rarely do. Her aged quietly within the convent, her hair thinned beneath the veil, her steps slowed in the corridors she once ruled, and yet her presence never weakened. Younger nuns lowered their eyes when she passed. Novices learned her habits before they learned their prayers. They feared her without understanding why. The abbess died first. Her replacement inherited rules, rituals, and Ilara. By then, Ilara was no longer an enforcer. She was a fixture, an authority without title, a warning without words. Punishments continued even when Ilara no longer directed them. The system no longer needed her. That was her greatest achievement. Fear had become tradition. Cruelty had become routine. Silence had become doctrine. When Ilara finally died, there were prayers, there was ceremony, there was reverence. They spoke of her devotion, her discipline, her obedience. No one spoke of the broken women, the vanished novices, the nights spent crying into stone floors. Her cell was cleaned, her belongings distributed, her name entered into the convent's records as a faithful servant of God. And yet, something remained. The convent never returned to what it had been. New nuns reported unease in the corridors, a sense of being watched. Rules were enforced even more harshly, not because anyone demanded it, but because it felt necessary, because it felt right. Ilara had proven something terrible, that faith, when stripped of compassion, becomes a weapon, that obedience, when elevated above humanity, creates monsters, and that institutions do not need evil intentions, only silence. If you walk past old convents in Europe today, you may feel it, the weight in the air, the way sound seems swallowed by stone, the way the windows never seem quite empty. That is not haunting. That is memory. Long after Ilara's death, the convent continued to wake at the same hour. Bells still rang, candles were still lit, prayers were still whispered into cold air. But something essential was gone. Not the discipline, not the rules, compassion. The women who arrived after Ilara never met her, never heard her voice, never saw her eyes linger too long, and yet they learned fear faster than faith. Novices spoke of dreams, not nightmares, dreams so quiet they were worse. Long corridors that never ended, doors that opened into empty cells, a presence that never touched them, only watched. Some woke crying without knowing why. Some forgot entire hours of their day. Some developed habits no one had taught them, standing perfectly still, lowering their eyes, holding their breath when footsteps passed. No one instructed them to do this. They simply knew. Decades later, when the convent's archives were reorganized, something unsettling surfaced. Gaps. Years where no names were recorded, pages where ink stopped mid-sentence, lists of novices with no departure dates. No deaths, no transfers, no explanations, just absence. One visiting cleric noted the irregularities. He asked questions carefully, respectfully. The sisters answered calmly, consistently. "We have always done things this way." He did not press further. No one ever did. There was a room in the convent that no one claimed. It appeared on no maps, held no official purpose, and yet it was never unused. Nuns passed it quickly. Novices avoided looking inside. The door was always unlocked, always. Inside, nothing remarkable. Stone floor, bare walls, no furniture. And still, no one lingered there. Those who entered reported the same sensation, not pain, not fear, judgment. As if the room remembered everything, every confession never spoken, every punishment endured in silence, every moment obedience replaced mercy. Some claimed the room was Ilara's former cell. Records did not confirm this. Records rarely did. Over time, the convent's rules grew harsher without instruction. Younger sisters enforced discipline more strictly than their elders. Punishments became preventative, corrections became preemptive, not because anyone demanded it, but because the walls seemed to expect it. This is how institutions survive monsters. They absorb them, they learn from them, and then they continue, perfectly capable of cruelty without a single cruel person in charge. Ilara was never exorcised because there was nothing supernatural about her. No possession, no madness, no sudden descent. Only structure, reward, silence. She became what the convent needed her to be, and when she was gone, the convent discovered it no longer needed her at all. If this story unsettles you, it is not because it is rare, it is because it is familiar. History is filled with places where cruelty wore the mask of order, where devotion replaced empathy, where silence was praised as virtue. And in those places, monsters were never hunted, they were promoted. Somewhere tonight, a corridor is quiet, a rule is obeyed without question, a voice is swallowed before it can speak, and the system continues.